Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to see everybody this morning. We're in Mark chapter 2, and we're ready for verse 18 in Mark chapter 2. There again, we talked last week, Jesus has started his ministry now, and so Mark's going to cover a lot of the actions he does, a lot of his miracles and other things that he does during his life here, so we'll be covering a lot of that. So let's start at verse 18. We'll read down through 22, and then we'll discuss that. The disciples of John and of the Pharisees were fasting. Then they came and said to him, "Why do the disciples of John and of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?" And Jesus said to them, "Can the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them. Then they will fast in those days. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, or else the new piece pulls away from the old, and the tear is made worse. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine bursts the wineskins. The wine is spilled, and the wineskins are ruined. But new wine must be put into new wineskins." So here we have a case where the disciples of John and the Pharisees were fasting. Now, was fasting ever commanded as a general practice? It wasn't. If you go, there were certain times in the Old Testament that we'll see them fasting, and it was usually during times of either distress or anxiety or sadness, or during times of meditation. Even in the in the New Testament, it was suggested that you fast when you meditate and you're praying to God and that kind of thing. Those are the times that you would fast. And so we always, the only thing we think about when we think about fasting is what? Not eating. Fasting was so much more encompassing than just not eating. It did incorporate your not eating a meal, but you were times of meditation and prayer and really into deep thought about whatever it was you were fasting, what the purpose was. So why were then John's disciples fasting? Well, in this case, but under the old law they did fast some, but it wasn't necessarily commanded that they had to. But at this particular time, there was a reason that John's disciples were fasting.
Was this while he was in jail?
He actually had died.
Okay.
So John, he was thrown into jail and he was beheaded. Of course, we know the story behind all of that. That was an evil act in itself. But at this time, they would have been fasting because John was dead. He had passed. So the Pharisees were fasting. Now, the disciples of the Pharisees, what were some of the problems of the fasting of the Pharisees?
They done it to man to see.
They did it to be seen. They did it to be seen of man. And Jesus gave some instructions about fasting back in Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 through 18. He said, "Moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites with a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, that they may appear to men to be fasting. I am sure to say to you that they have the reward. But you, when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, so that you do not appear to men to be fasting, but to your Father who is in secret place, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly." So Jesus given instruction there is, when you're fasting, you don't do that to be seen of men. You don't do that so other people look at you and say, "Oh, you're fasting." You do that at a time when you're meditating and that kind of thing. So during this time they would have been. But they questioned, said, "Why they're fasting? Why are you not?" And of course, I think what had happened also is the Pharisees had turned fasting into a command, even though it wasn't a command. They were holding people accountable for fasting when it was not necessarily commanded, even under the old law that commanded that they had to fast. There were just some certain times when they did fast. And we see that when you go to the Old Testament, you'll see during these sad times and at deaths and that kind of thing. Remember David when his son was sick, and God had told him that he would die, and he was fasting and he was in sackcloth and ashes. But then after his son died, he didn't fast anymore. So they're doing that, and so they're questioning why they did that. And the Pharisees had made it a practice to fast twice a week. Now, how do we know that? Well, remember when the Pharisee and the tax collector went up to pray, and he was saying, he was boosting himself up, and he said, "Here's what I do." And one of the things he said is, "I fast twice a week." So that was one of the things. So they had made that a common practice, even though it wasn't commanded. So they use this as tradition. But Jesus is going to use this as a teaching moment. And so, what does he mean when he starts talking about the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? They don't fast while he's with them, but when the bridegroom is gone, they fast. What is he talking about?
Well, he's pointing to his death.
He is pointing to his death. That he is going to reference his death, but he uses a common practice that they used back then to show that, to teach that. So what was this common practice? I was hoping y'all could tell me.
Celebration.
Yeah, so there was a common practice during the celebration when the bridegroom was there before they were married. Remember, they would have a parade down the street, from the bride's house to the bridegroom's house, and they would light the lamps with oil, and all those things are done. And remember, their marriages back then, when you were engaged, this was a year-long process. This wasn't, they drug this thing out for a while. And so, while the bridegroom was there, they didn't fast. They were in celebration time. But when the bridegroom was taken away, once the bridegroom had been married and he moved away, that's when they fasted. They didn't fast while the bridegroom was there. And so he says, when the bridegroom leaves, that's when they'll fast. And so, like Mark says, he's talking about himself at that point. They're not going to, his disciples have no reason to fast right now. There's nothing for them to be sad about or anything, going on right now for them to fast for. But there again, at his death, when he's departed from them, then they'll fast. That's when they'll be in a state of mourning, and they'll be fasting and praying and all those things. That's when it'll happen. So he's trying to give them a little bit of a preempt of once he dies, that's when his disciples will be fasting. But right now they have him with them, so it's really a time of celebration, and he's there, they're learning with him. And then he talks about putting a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment and a new pulls away. All right, some of you who are seamstresses, so what happens when you put a new cloth with the old cloth, when you sew it in?
It doesn't G-haul.
Well, what happens? I don't.
It's apart.
Why does it do that?
It's old.
I'm going to go to the source. Tell me, why does it do that?
It's already worn.
Okay.
Stretched.
Okay. So when the new garment is washed, what happens to it? It shrinks and tears away. So is there a way you can put a new garment, a new piece of cloth on an old garment? Only if you know what you're doing, right? So,
Don't
yeah.
they call that quilting?
Huh?
Don't they call that quilting?
Quilting?
Quilting, where they take old cloth and
Use the old cloth with old cloth.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. But he's, if I got a pair of pants and it's got a big rip in it, and I'm gonna put a piece of cloth in there. And my mama used to do this. Y'all remember the iron-on patches they used to make? You put the iron-on patch in there. Well, guess what? It didn't last either. But he's saying you can't put the new cloth in with the old cloth because it's going to shrink and it's going to rip away. It's not going to work. It tears away. And so you don't do that. And also, he also uses the wineskins. Now, what did they use for wineskins back then? Huh? Well, that's what they put in them. But yeah, they put wine in them. But what did they use? Sometimes they use the intestines or bladders of animals. They would use bladders. And so, what happens to new wine when you put it in something?
Expands.
It's new.
Expands.
It ferments and it expands. So if you got an old skin that's already dried up and already stretched, and you put new wine in it and it starts to expand, what happens?
Burst.
It blows up. It's not going to work. But you put it in a new one that's flexible, then it can expand with the wine that's been fermented. So, what in the world is he talking about? You know, he's giving us these examples of old cloth, new cloth, and giving an example of the old wine skin and new wine skin and the old wine, new wine. What is he trying to teach them there?
Judaism is the old, and the new wineskin is Christianity.
Okay, so you got the new gospel that's coming in, Christianity is coming in, and you got the old law. So you can't mix the old law with the new law. And so he says you don't put them together, you don't mix those two together. And all along his teaching, and remember when he said, and I think it was in the first chapter when he said, the main purpose he had come was to do what? Was to teach the new gospel. That was his purpose. And so all of his teaching had to do with this new gospel that was coming in. And so you couldn't mix the old gospel with the new gospel. You can't mix those two together. And remember, even after Jesus' death, and the apostles started teaching the new gospel of Christ, and when some of the Jews were converted to that new gospel, what did they try to do? Bring in some of those old traditions and some of the old laws, and they had to go back and teach. You can't. That's done away with. It's done. So he's teaching them, even now, this early in his ministry, he's teaching them that there is a new gospel. There's a new law coming in. You can't mix this old with the new. You can't mix these two together. And the reasons for fasting under the New Testament were also going to be different. And this tradition that the Pharisees had created of fasting twice a week, that's something they had created. What was going to happen to that tradition? It's done away. You don't have that anymore. So he's trying to teach them there's going to be an old, there's going to be a new, and preempting them from this. Do you think they understood what he was? I'm thinking that they, but we don't see where they questioned him. But I think his answers sometimes were so good that even if they didn't understand, they couldn't question it because they were embarrassed to even ask what it was. But, and it's one of those things where if you were there, it might have been more clear to them, what was said. But he's starting now, and remember, a lot of what he did, a lot of what he taught was for the people there, but it was also for his apostles. And so when they're questioning about them not fasting and what was going on, and he's teaching about, this new law that's coming and the old law, and you can't mix those two together. I think a lot of that teaching was also for his disciples, so that they understood, because this was going to be a challenge for them going forward. It's going to be a real challenge of what was happening. So good lessons there. Any questions, comments on this section about fasting and what he taught there about the old law and new law? I've always wondered, could we be guilty of pulling in the old law to the new law? If we're not careful? Could we?
It's in the Bible.
Huh?
It's in the Bible.
It's in the Bible, but what's the old law there for? Why do we still have it? Why do we study it? It's for our learning, and it was a schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. We fully understand Jesus because we understand the Old Testament. We understand the old law. We have it there, but we have to be careful that we don't take the teachings and traditions of the old law and ourselves try to bring them in. Those are done away. Not that they're there for our learning. And if you really, you come to learn more about the mind of God, don't you, when you study the Old Testament. And what his thought processes and all those. But those old laws are there for us to learn about, but we can't apply them today. We can't bring them forward today and try to mix them in. And that's what was happening back, especially after Jesus' death, and they brought the new gospel in.
But 9 of the 10 commandments are brought forward in the
Yeah.
New Testament.
Yeah, 9 of the 10 are repeated in the New Testament, for sure. The only one is the Sabbath day. That's the only one it's not. It's a good point. Those are brought right over. And a lot of them are the same. Those commandments, principles there are there. So let's read 23 through 27. It said, now it happened that they went through the grain field on the Sabbath. And as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? But he said to them, have you never read that David did what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him, how he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priest, and also gave some to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. So they're going through this grain field on the Sabbath day. The disciples were pulling some of the grain off of the grain there, and they were eating it. What law were they breaking of the Sabbath that they were being accused of?
Working on the Sabbath.
It was work on the Sabbath day.
But wasn't that stealing? They went through the fields and got what they wanted to? That's taking what didn't belong to them.
Well, it didn't say what grain fields they were going through, and I think they did share, because a lot of times they left grain on the side for people who were coming through. So, and Jesus didn't say they didn't accuse them of breaking any laws as far as doing that. The law they were breaking was they were doing what was not lawful, which was working. They saw them as working because you weren't supposed to gather anything, you weren't supposed to do any kind of work on a Sabbath day. But his disciples obviously were hungry, and so they said, hey, they're doing what's not lawful. Now, do you think they really were concerned about them getting these grains and eating them?
They just went catching.
They were always looking for something that they could accuse Jesus of. Always looking for something. And so when they were going through there and they were eating some of these grains and plucking some of the heads of grain and eating those, I don't know, have you ever gone through a field and just plucked stuff off?
These days they'll shoot you.
Yeah. I mean, even if it's your own, do you really walk through and just, now when we were kids, we walked through the tomato patch, eat a tomato off, but this is grain, and they're eating this. These guys are pretty hungry. I mean, they're hungry, and there's a need here. So Jesus uses this example of David. Now, what is he talking about, David? What did David do? And of course, David would have been one of their heroes under their old laws and whatnot. So what was it David did that he uses this example?
Well, he ate the showbread.
Okay, so they went, he and his warriors that were with him, on the Sabbath day, they were hungry. They went in, and so what was this showbread?
Was it in the tabernacle?
It was in the tabernacle. Yeah, there was in the first part of the tabernacle that they went, and it was for the priests that were supposed to eat it. They were the ones that were supposed to eat of the showbread. So he says, David, would that have really been unlawful at that point? In reality, it was. It would have been unlawful for David to go in, but they went in because they were hungry. They were in need and they were hungry. And because of that, he ate it and gave it to some of his followers that were with him, for them to eat as well. And so he gave it to them. So then he goes into, he says, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. So that's a deep teaching he was trying to teach them. So what was he trying to tell them there when he said the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath? And that he is therefore a Son of Man. Jesus was also the Lord of the Sabbath as well.
He could actually be exempt from.
Sure. Who had created the Sabbath?
It's fallen.
It was God had created. Of course, Jesus was there, during the creation, during all this time, during the Ten Commandments, when they established the Sabbath day. And remember, the Sabbath day was a day, why did God set aside this Sabbath day? It was a day of rest. So, remember he said, just as God rested on the seventh day after he had created, the earth, this was set aside as, and when he says here, it was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. It was a day that man was supposed to rest, right? It was a day of rest for man. It was also a day when they also remembered God. It was a day of that meditation and when they gave that worship time to God. And so when he makes that point there, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Can we be guilty of not setting aside a time in our life to rest? Absolutely. We can be very guilty of that. So he said, just as God rested on the seventh day, they set up the Sabbath day for one with the purpose of rest. They couldn't work on the Sabbath day. They couldn't do anything on the Sabbath day. And they were supposed to consecrate that day to God. We don't have the Sabbath day. But when he says the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath, who rules over the Sabbath day? It was God, right? And it was Jesus, because he was there during the creation of it. So if he wanted to allow his disciples to eat grain on the Sabbath day, did he have that authority? Absolutely. And that's what he's trying to tell them. He has authority not only of the old laws, but also of the new laws. So he had commandment over those as well. I think about a lot about, if you compare the Sabbath day to the first day of the week. Of course, Sabbath day had a lot of commandments that went with it about not working and what you could do and couldn't do. Then we have what's known as the Lord's Day, which we're doing today. We're worshiping today on the Lord's Day. But what are the difference in those two? We're not commanded to not work, right? You don't have those physical commands that go with it. But he did set aside a day. And what would have happened if God had not set aside a day for us to come together, to worship, to do the things we do? Would man abide by doing that?
Well, God told them to have sacrifices, and I'm not real thrilled about sacrifice, but if God said do it, that's what they did.
Yeah, and so now we have the Lord's Day. Do we keep it as holy as they did the Sabbath day?
No.
No. And I think many times we may miss the Lord's Day. Because we've set parameters on it ourselves. And our parameters are Bible study an hour, worship an hour. We might come back on Sunday night for an hour. What's the rest of the day? It's our day, right? You can do whatever you want to do. Should we hold the Lord's Day more in awe than we do?
I think
Everything used to be closed on Sunday evening.
Yes.
Before that. I would say for that reason.
Right, right.
I think if you're doing what God has called you to do all week long,
Yeah,
you're physically and mentally exhausted. So yes, that day of rest is needed because you've been at what God wants you to do all week.
yeah. And like I say, he has us to come to, he said, don't miss this day. Don't miss the assembling of yourselves together and, come together, and we need this. Well, there again, this was not created for God. This is created for us. To come together and worship Him, remember Christ, and do all the things that we come together to worship, to build up each other and help each other. And I think sometimes we miss the Lord's Day. And like Harold said, I can remember when I was a kid, everybody held Sunday, the first day of the week, as a day that was given for worship. If you wanted to get gas, you didn't get gas on Sunday, you got gas on Saturday. If you wanted to go to the store, you went to the store on Saturday, you didn't go to the store on Sunday. If you wanted to, if you're traveling, you better be ready on Saturday, right? Because a lot of the markets didn't open, people didn't open, because it was regarded as that day for people to worship and to give that day. And then later on, even when that changed, they still had certain things you couldn't do until a certain time. And I always thought it was interesting that you couldn't buy beer till after, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock? After worship. Then you could go buy beer, right? Then you could buy alcohol after worship service. But even now that is still applies in a lot of cities now. That still does apply. But it's gone away, and I think we have, when he says the Sabbath was created for man and not man for the Sabbath, same thing. I think the Lord's Day was made for who? For man, for us, for rest, for worship, for coming together, for building each other up and singing together, praying together, and doing all the things we need to be coming together to do. And I think we take that day so lightly now. So people regard it so lightly now that it's a shame. And what Jesus said there, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. He had authority over the Sabbath and what they did on the Sabbath. He has authority over our Lord's Day today. And I think we should hold it more in awe maybe than we do.
Well, there's restoration to the human soul and spirit by coming together.
Sure.
For the time we're here. But we should also take time, once we go home, to have an individual time with God.
Yeah.
Because there's more inspiration and nourishment that can be had there.
Right.
It doesn't have to happen on Sunday, but it just happens that it's the Lord's Day.
It's the Lord's Day. Right. And we should take advantage of that day.
Our secular laws law is based on Christianity.
Yeah.
Actually from the beginning. And of course, law that's left us, so.
Yeah. We've gotten away from that. Yeah, our laws are based on Christianity and what we did, and now we have gotten away from that. But there again, we should hold the Lord's Day as important as they did Sabbath Day, and keep in regards to keeping it and doing the things we ought to do there and encouraging each other. So good study this way. We'll start next week with chapter 3 next week.